We have no free will, and that's great news. Greetings, my name is Science-Hansten, and today we will discuss an issue that has been debated for literally thousands of years, free will. It's still controversial, but with scientific advances, the debate is starting to lean heavily in one direction. You can probably tell which direction from the title. By the way, I took this photo one morning from Squamish Harbor on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. These trees are about 3 miles away, and I'm looking across the fjord called the Hood Canal. So there are two videos. This is part one, where I will introduce the free will problem and present the arguments. And then part two is the video where I will describe why it would be so great if we stopped believing in free will. There are almost no downsides, along with truly awesome upsides, as you will see. In the introduction, in this part one, I'll do a very brief history and talk about why free will has been such an intractable problem for millennia. Then we will discuss the arguments made by philosophers, biologists, physicists, and a few other people such as historians, writers, journalists, etc. Now, a couple of words about terminology. I'm going to use the term free will skeptic. And I mean that to mean people who basically don't believe in free will. I didn't want to leave any wiggle room that you might think skeptic was somebody who was kind of on the fence. Free will skeptic, I didn't want to use denier because that has accumulated some pejorative baggage with climate change denial and that sort of thing. So free will skeptic means they do not believe in free will. The stakes are high. One might be tempted to think that the free will debate is just some academic issue with scientists and philosophers having a spat about trivial matters with no practical importance, but I think it's exactly the opposite. I would argue that the free will question is one of the most important questions that humans have ever faced, and I'm not alone in that belief. Philosophers generally know the stakes are high, which is why the arguments are so, among philosophers, which are so, let's say, spirited. John Searle is an eminent philosopher. He's in his 90s now, and I think he's still alive as far as I know. Susan Blackmore is a writer, and she interviewed John Searle a few years ago. By the way, Blackmore is a free will skeptic, and she lives her life with that in view. She says she lives every day with the view that she does not believe in free will. So Searle knows the stakes are high. Blackmore asked him what would happen if we decided free will was an illusion. He replied that it would, quote, be a bigger revolution in our thinking than Einstein or Copernicus or Newton or Galileo or Darwin. It would alter our whole conception of our relation with the universe. I do not think this is hyperbole. Neil deGrasse Tyson is also on board with no free will. Tyson and comedian Chuck Nice, who is wonderful, by the way, they interviewed Stanford neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky about his book on free will, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will is the subtitle. This was published in 2024, and in my opinion, this is the best book ever written on free will. And it's written in a very engaging style. It's actually fun to read. And I've been studying free will for many decades, so I'm an aficionado of writings on free will. So at the end of the interview, they're discussing the enormous positive impact on society if people understood the lack of free will. And Sapolsky said, well, it might take centuries to see the societal benefits of free will denial. I think he's being generous there. I think it would actually be quite a bit shorter. Tyson replied, I would like to believe that the depths of compassion that a society without free will promotes would come to us sooner than that. Then Tyson, holding up a copy of Determined by Sapolsky, said, quote, this book, oh my gosh, some people write a book just to write a book. This one has the power to shift the center mass of civilization. Again, I do not think this is overstated. Now, why do I personally find free will so interesting? Well, my scientific field is drug interactions and pharmacokinetics, but I also teach philosophy of science at the University of Washington. So it's actually a perfect fit for me. So it resides at the intersection between science and philosophy. I thought it might be a good idea to give you a very quick overview of my free will journey, where I'm coming from on the free will thing. First of all, as a teenager, I was fascinated by the central role that luck plays in people's lives. I had observed this in other people and in myself for that matter. So this was something that I found a fascinating issue. But I couldn't convince anyone of this. I took a speech class in college, and my first talk, I was petrified. I was very shy, and getting up in front of the class was difficult. But the title of my speech was The Radical Contingency of Human Existence. I probably could have picked a catchier title. So how did people respond? It did not go well. They basically acted like cows staring at a train, as the French say. So I dropped the speech class that afternoon, given that failure. Then in the 1970s, I became convinced that science ruled out free will. I had just spent a decade heavily immersed in science. I still remember the exact moment, even where I was. After graduating from UC San Francisco, I was working at Stanford Medical School on a drug interaction research program. And I was chatting with a cardiologist friend after dinner, and he actually looked a little bit like this stock image. And I asked him, have you ever wondered how we can make free choices given that we are part of the natural world and everything that happens is in a causal chain of events that is subject to universal scientific laws? Now, he was a smart guy, but he couldn't see the problem. He didn't see why I was asking this question. So I thought maybe it was a dumb question, and I kind of let it drop for a while. I retained my free will skepticism, but I was busy with my work on drug interactions, so it pretty much remained just an intellectual dilemma. But then the first watershed occurred. I read Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio. I know I was going to grab it off the shelf there and show it to you, but anyway, it's called Descartes' Error by neurology professor Antonio Damasio. I realized after reading this book that human behavior could be markedly altered by changes in the brain. Now, at this point, I realized that we not only had a theoretical problem of the causal chain of events subject to scientific laws, but we also have a very real practical problem based on the functioning of the brain. I'd heard of Phineas Gage, but Damasio's description of Gage, along with discussing his patients who had similar prefrontal cortex damage, made all this really very real. All of a sudden, I started applying my free will skepticism to my daily life, and just this much was transformative. We'll talk about this more in video 2, but it really did change how I behaved in the world and how I reacted, especially how I reacted to other people who were displaying, shall we say, assholery on occasion. So then I read, in 2024, I read Behave, which I haven't talked about yet, but this is Behave by Robert Sapolsky, and it's called The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And then I read Determined, which is the book on free will. Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. Actually, I ordered Determined before it was published, so I read Behave first, which was really quite fortuitous. Now, it's not for the faint of heart. It's about 800 pages, but it's worth the effort. It's extremely well written, witty, and it was a perfect introduction to Determined. So, looking at those two books, in Behave, Professor Sapolsky knocked down the edifice of the false claim that the origins of human behavior are simple and that we control our intentions. And Sapolsky says that he assumed people would get the point after reading this book, Behave, and that they would understand that there was no free will. But then he found out that free will was hanging on to a ledge by its fingertips. So he wrote Determined, in which he pried off those fingers one by one. Chaos theory, he devotes 2 chapters to chaos theory. He actually devotes half of the book on free will to debunking these things like chaos theory, where people try to shoehorn free will into the situation. And he pointed out on chaos theory, as other people have too, that unpredictability is completely consistent with determinism. Chaos is determined. Everybody agrees on that. So that is a non-starter. Quantum mechanics, this one, I even figured out that this didn't work. I could never understand why free will believers were clinging to this, because it gets you nowhere. Randomness is not free will. Quantum mechanics shouldn't take more than a few sentences. But anyway, he goes, I think he also has 2 chapters on that, showing why that doesn't work. Now, emergence, the third finger there, that's one that initially seems promising, but it does fall apart when you get into the weeds, because it still requires an uncaused cause. We'll talk about that later, an uncaused cause of some sort in order to have this generate free will. So emergence doesn't work either. And then finally on the pinky, is the argument, it's obvious. This is not a serious argument. Unfortunately, it is the argument most people use. They think that why do people believe free will exists? Well, they think that, that we look at our options, we pick one. It's as simple as that. So free will is obviously real. But when someone argues for free will in this manner, they're committing the informal logic fallacy called argument from incredulity, which I talk about in my philosophy of science class. They're basically saying, I simply cannot believe that I lack free will because it feels so much like I have it. This is not a compelling argument, and we don't allow that kind of argument in science and in philosophy. The actual evidence suggests that free will is an illusion, albeit a very powerful illusion. So if you ask the question, can I act based on my intents, the answer is clearly yes. I intend to have a cup of coffee in the morning, and usually it's 2 or 3, but pretty soon I drink a cup of coffee. Doesn't that prove free will? Well, no, acting on your intent is not free will, even if it feels that way, and we will discuss why in a moment. Animals, for that matter, form intents and act on them. Yoda formed the intent to sit on my papers, and then he acted. This is the late, great Yoda, Norwegian forest cat extraordinaire. But since almost everyone thinks they have free will, how could the vast majority of humans be wrong about this? Well, just because most people think something, it doesn't mean that it is true. As Ludwig Wittgenstein said, most people can be wrong. From it seeming to me or to everyone to be so, it doesn't follow that it is so. Humans have believed many things in the past that we have now learned are not true. Such as thinking people who have seizures are possessed by the devil and that kind of thing, and many, many other things that people thought, that virtually everybody thought was the case, that proved out not to be the case. Now, with any luck, free will be in that category at some point, maybe some point soon. What can we ask? What we can ask is whether it can make sense to doubt it. Wittgenstein adds, and in the case of free will, there is ample reason to doubt that it actually is real. Do I think about free will when I'm picking a shirt? No, actually I don't. The issue of free will is not important when making the mundane choices in my daily life, so I don't even think about it one way or another. So what seems to be true, me picking out my shirt, may actually be false. So even when you know the balls on the right there are the same size, the one in the back just looks bigger. So you can know that those balls are the same size intellectually and still look at them and say, wow, they do look different. But for the important things, such as how we treat, so the mundane things like picking out shirts or picking out ice cream flavors, you don't have to worry about whether there's free will or not. But for the important things, such as how we treat other people, for that matter, how we treat ourselves, weighing in on public policy, we understand that free will is an illusion. And as we discuss in detail in video 2, this could result in a more tolerant, humane, less vindictive, less hate-filled world, populated with people who have more peace of mind and who have very few regrets. It really could do that, and it does do that for the people who have adopted this worldview. So I hope you stick with me for both videos because I saved the best for last. So how can we take action? Why is this step not evidence of free will, where we have an intent and then we act on it? This is actually a very easy question to answer. It's very straightforward. We have a settled scientific neurobiologic answer to this question. Let's take an example. Let's say you go to an ice cream shop and order chocolate. This certainly seems like you had free will. You have an intent. You take the action that leads to getting a 2-scoop chocolate ice cream cone. Feels like free will. Seems like it is. After all, you could have had vanilla. It would have been the wrong choice, of course, but you could have. So how did you accomplish getting your chocolate cone? Well, this is well known. The decision to act, in this case to get a chocolate cone, is made in the prefrontal cortex, which sends a message to the motor cortex. Now, I'm simplifying a little bit here. There's the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex, but it doesn't affect the overall situation. This is the basic pathway. Now, it's critical to note that I have absolutely no idea why I like chocolate ice cream. That's a really important point. It sounds simple, but it's very important. I just like it. I don't know why. And by the way, I should say final intent because you can vacillate at some point, but you eventually make a final decision on a flavor. So neurobiologists call this the point of no return. So changing your mind doesn't affect these arguments at all because the dithering takes place before the signal, that arrow going to the right there. It happens before that arrow goes to the right and the signal gets to the motor cortex. So dithering is irrelevant. Then the motor cortex sends messages down to various skeletal muscles to perform the action. It sends messages to various cranial nerves that control speaking, so you're able to articulate to the server 2 scoops of chocolate. At the same time, you can multitask. At the same time, the motor cortex sends messages to the median nerve and the ulnar nerve, so you can point at the chocolate ice cream. There was absolutely no free will in any of these processes. Once the prefrontal cortex sends the message, it just happens automatically. The neurons are just talking to other neurons. But wait, you say, making the decision in the prefrontal cortex, that's where the free will happens. Well, actually not, as we will discuss. So there's no free will in this step, and it's pretty well established that that's the case. We know how people take action after they form an intent. It's a completely automatic process of neurobiology, and there's no way to sneak free will into the process. So now let's get to the stickier problem. You say, well, how about the origins of the intent? We'll call this step A. Can we salvage free will from the process of forming our intent? The answer is no. This question is staggeringly complex. Unlike step B, which is relatively simple, as we've discussed, step A is staggeringly complex because our intent derives from countless influences, all acting in concert and across purposes in varying degrees and combination at various times in our lives, going all the way back to our prenatal period, our culture, our ancestors, back as far as you want to go. Professor Sapolsky covers this beautifully in his lectures and in his books. So we came to be the type of person, well, let me first go through what those are. Genes, prenatal conditions can be very important. Epigenetics, a rising field that actually has been around since the early 1900s, but it's just gotten it's important now. Parenting, life experiences, trauma, brain damage, mental illness, tumors pressing on various organs in the brain, stress of various kinds, poverty, ACE scores, that's adverse childhood experience scores, pollution. By the way, those ACE scores are huge in how people turn out. Pollution, hormone levels, peer pressure, substance abuse, nutrition, disease states, ancestors, cultural influences, and thousands of other things. So we came to be the type of person to have a given intent due to an unbelievably complex, convoluted, and interwoven congeries of factors that are impossible to sort out. And here's the important part: you didn't have an iota of control over any of it. So step B was out of your control because it's just a simple activation of well-known nerve pathways. But so is step A. And you say, well, wait a minute, take nutrition. I'm the one who decided to go on the rutabaga and kombucha diet, but that gets you nowhere. It just pushes the question back to, how did I become the type of person to go on a rutabaga and kombucha diet? As Professor Sapolsky would say, there's no escape. It's turtles all the way down. You'll get that if you read his book. So intent leads to action, but we don't control our intent. Here's an example. In every relationship, there is one person who loads the dishwasher like a Scandinavian architect and one who loads it like a raccoon on crystal meth. This is true in our household, but there's a serious question here. I did not choose to be the kind of person who would load the dishwasher like a Scandinavian architect, and my dear wife Ruth did not choose to be a raccoon on crystal meth. It's just the way we are. It's the same if you like chocolate ice cream. You didn't choose to prefer chocolate, you just do. By the way, I suspect that her using the raccoon method was her clever way of getting me to insist on doing the dishes. I have no proof of that, but it does seem likely. So here's the Schopenhauer, Einstein, Sapolsky formulation. A man can surely do what he wills to do, but he cannot determine what he wills. This simple two-part statement, let me back up to that one again. A man can surely do what he wills to do. This was captured by Einstein, who was quoting Schopenhauer. And all of this is supported. The reason why I put Sapolsky up there is all of this is supported by the neurobiology arguments that he and other neuroscientists have made. But he cannot determine what he wills. That's it in a nutshell. Okay, another transition. This happens to be taken from that same spot as I took that first photo, except it's a little clearer because you can see Mount Rainier, but it's the same general area. Okay, the philosophy of free will. The issue of free will has been discussed by philosophers for 2.5 millennia. Now, we'll talk about the Greek atomists, Democritus, Leucippus, Epicurus, under the physics section. So they made basically physics arguments. So we'll consider them there, even though they're usually considered to be philosophers. So St. Augustine and Boethius tried to reconcile God's foreknowledge of future events with human free will. They both struggled with this and came up with a solution. We're not going to discuss this because it's theological. Boethius, Augustine's still worth reading too, but Boethius is definitely worth reading for other reasons than his free will discussion, which I didn't find too compelling. Michel de Montaigne, my hero, he also talked about free will. He wondered how an immaterial spirit or soul could interact with the physical body. So he said, how a spiritual impression can cut such a swath in a massive, that's the soul or your spirit, in a massive and solid object like the human body. And the nature of the connection between these wonderful springs of action no man has ever known. So I'm quite fond of Montaigne. Where's his book? Here it is. I've been through this. It's a monster. I've been through it several times. But he, along with Nietzsche, are my two main philosophical influences. Montaigne's 500th birthday is coming up in a short 7 years, so put it on your calendars. Then there are the dozens of delightful letters between René Descartes and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, where they talked about free will. You can still get these online. So Descartes claimed that matter is separate from mind, his famous dualism, and our free will comes from our immaterial mind acting on our material body. In her response, Elizabeth profusely praises Descartes and apologizes for her many reasoning errors and stupidity. You women will recognize this phenomenon. She said, "Your goodness shows not only in your pointing out and correcting the faults of my reasoning, but also in your using false praise. So I am ashamed to admit that I have found in myself all the causes of error that you mentioned in your letter, and that I can't yet banish them entirely." And now this is the great part. She pulls her best Peter Falk Columbo impersonation and says, in essence, "But I just can't help wondering," and then she proceeds to totally dismantle his arguments. For example, she said, "I've never been able to conceive of what is immaterial in any way except what is not material, and that can't enter into causal relationships with matter." She was obviously a very bright person. Now, Descartes came up with some lame argument to show she was wrong, but I put the winner as clearly Elizabeth in this case. Francois La Rochefoucauld, his maxims are still available and they're wonderful. It's only like a 80 or 100-page book, and they are definitely worth reading. He said, this is amazing that he would say this back in the 17th century. "The bodily humors have their normal appointed course that imperceptibly guides and bends the will. They work together and one by one exert a mysterious influence within us. Thus, without our knowledge, they play a considerable part in all of our actions." This is exactly what neuroscience is showing now. A melange of imperceptible influences working in various combinations and intensities that end up, quote, "bending our will without our knowledge." Remarkable that he said that way back then. We talked about that complexity earlier. And here's another thing that is profound. He also said it's easier to know man in general than to understand one man in particular. This also fits perfectly with modern neurobiology. They know, current neurobiologists know, for example, that damage to a certain part of the brain may increase the likelihood of certain behaviors statistically, but in any given individual, it may or may not occur. More on this later. Another person who I've been reading for a decade or two, but just recently have really gotten into. You gotta love Spinoza. He's one of the most important philosophers for the free will thing, so I'm going to dilate on him just a little. His grandparents left Portugal to escape the Inquisition. He was a child prodigy, and the elders in the synagogue were amazed at how brilliant this kid was. They had high hopes for him. But over time, he became skeptical of the Jewish doctrines, and the Jewish authority, eventually it got to the point where the Jewish authorities issued a writ of harem. He basically got excommunicated. And this is a thing to behold. They didn't screw around. This is his writ of harem. This is only part of it. They said, "From the present hour to place him in anathema, with the following malediction, with the judgment of the angels and the sentence of the saints, we anathematize, execrate, curse, and cast out Baruch de Espinosa, the whole of the sacred community assenting. Let him be accursed by day, accursed by night. Let him be accursed in his lying down, and accursed in his rising up, accursed in his going out, and accursed in his coming in. May the Lord nevermore pardon or acknowledge him. May the wrath and displeasure of the Lord burn henceforth against this man." Then they went on to say that people couldn't associate with him or get within, 3 cubits of him or whatever. It was kind of an ancient version of a restraining order, basically. So the Christians condemned him also because they didn't like what he said. So he got it from all sides. Now, amazingly, the harem is still in effect. Spinoza scholar Jonathan Israel was at the 2015 meeting in Amsterdam, where I think it was 3 rabbis got together and had a meeting about this, and they reaffirmed the harem, and it was again reaffirmed in 2021. So there's no statute of limitations for poor Spinoza. He was very clear that free will is a total illusion, and he talks about this frequently in his Ethics, which I had read a couple of times. I have it back behind me there. It's a relatively small book, maybe 150, 200 pages, something like that. But he said basically that humans act based on prior causes, and these causes are subject to the laws of nature. This is a fairly simple argument, but it's profound. And he also recognized that free will skepticism reduced anxiety and frustration and provided peace of mind. So he saw, first of all, he argued that there were very good scientific reasons why it couldn't occur. And then he said, that's actually a good thing. Now, I've dabbled in Spinoza for years, but especially his ethics, as I said, but I finally bit the bullet, and just a month or two ago, I got his, this is, again, not for the faint of heart, his collected works, volume 1 and volume 2 of his collected works. But after reading what he had to say about free will, I decided that I really had to read the rest of him. So this came from actually Tractatus Politicus. He was also a political philosopher and a political philosopher of genius, actually. It wasn't just his ethics. So let me read the first sentence only. Let's just focus on the first sentence. I took great pains not to laugh at human actions or to mourn them or to curse them, but only to understand them. Now, almost always, this quote is quoted and requoted, just that one sentence, everywhere. I've seen it many, many places. But they usually forget to add the rest of the quote, the context in which he actually said that, which is really important for our purposes. So after saying that first sentence, he said, so I've contemplated human affects like love, hate, anger, envy, love of esteem, compassion, and the other emotions, not as vices or virtues of human nature, but as properties which pertain to it in the same way heat, cold, storms, thunder, etc. pertain to the nature of air. Though these things are inconvenient, they're still necessary, and we have definite causes through which we strive to understand their nature. So again, he brings this around to the fact that this is just part of a scientific worldview, which he did have. Now, this second part of this quote could have been written yesterday. Okay, another very important aspect, and we mentioned this just briefly before, can we cause ourselves, this self-caused cause issue. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche had many profound arguments against free will, and they appear from his earliest writings, like Daybreak, all the way to the end of his sane life where he was writing. I could do a whole lecture on Nietzsche and free will, but instead I'll just sprinkle a few quotes around. And he said, the causa sui, that means self-caused, okay? So a person who causes themselves, is the best self-contradiction that has been conceived so far. It is a perversion of logic, but the extravagant pride of man has managed to entangle itself profoundly with just this nonsense. The desire for freedom of the will in the superlative metaphysical sense, and what he means by that is the sense that we normally think of free will, that we can do this or do that. We have control over our actions, which still holds sway. The desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself and to absolve the world, ancestors, chance, and society involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui, uncaused cause, and to pull oneself up into existence by the hair out of the swamps of nothingness. Typical, beautiful writing by Nietzsche. So let's unpack this argument a little bit. What Nietzsche is saying is that if we want to claim that we have free will, we individuals would have to be an uncaused cause. We would have to remove ourselves from the causal nexus of events in the universe. There's no mechanism by which we could possibly pull this off. This statement, in my view, is one of the strongest philosophical arguments against free will. There are many others, of course, but I think this is one of the strongest philosophical arguments against free will. We can't be an uncaused cause. Another thing that Nietzsche talked about was, can you choose your next thought? And many other people have talked about this. Sam Harris and many other people who deny free will, who are free will skeptics. No, you can't. Thoughts, emotions, and intentions all appear in your mind spontaneously. You don't decide on a thought before you think it, because that would just be another spontaneous thought. You get to an infinite, just like we talked about before. an infinite regress. So, as Bernardo Kastrup says, who is a computer scientist slash philosopher, and more from him later, if we could choose our emotions, everybody would be happy all the time. So no, we don't choose thoughts, emotions, and intentions. They just come to us. And Nietzsche knew this. He captured it well. He said, a thought comes when it wishes, not when I wish. And if you think about it, it's true. Thoughts just arrive. Okay, and then this statement you've already heard. We talked about this earlier. You can do what you will, but you cannot will what you will. You could paraphrase this as saying, you can do what you want to do, but you cannot determine what you want. Again, this is the crux of the free will debate, and it fits perfectly with scientific principles, especially neurobiology. And by the way, Schopenhauer had a strong scientific background. He was in medical school for a couple of years before switching to philosophy, and he maintained a strong interest in science after that. For that matter, Spinoza and Nietzsche also had strong scientific backgrounds. Probably not a coincidence. So this came from Schopenhauer's, I have it here somewhere, Schopenhauer's prize essay. It's this one here. Schopenhauer's prize essay on freedom of the will. In 1837, the Norwegian Society of Sciences announced a contest where people were encouraged to submit an essay on free will. And so Schopenhauer submitted this, and it won the gold medal. It won the prize that the Norwegians had put up. So is this view correct? Well, I think it is. Can you choose what you want? Something, well, this is a question you can ask. Can you choose to want something other than what you actually want? And I think the answer is no to this. And again, modern, current free will skeptics have brought this issue up. For example, can you choose to want vanilla instead of chocolate? No, you can get a vanilla just to be perverse, but you can't want to want vanilla if you like chocolate like I do. I don't see any excuse for vanilla, to be honest. So use a worse example. You could eat a maggot salad if you were forced to, for example, but you can't choose to want to eat a maggot salad. Maybe if you're starving, but so that's the issue, is you can't choose to want something other than what you want. And Sam Harris had talked about that. You can do what you decide to do, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. He also talks about the fact that free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes over which we exert no conscious control. And this is the same issue again about not choosing our thoughts. Another philosopher, Bertrand Russell, who I've a bunch of his books behind me on the shelf there. I'm fond of him as well. And he's more of an analytical philosopher, unlike some of the ones, continental philosophers I've talked about before with Schopenhauer and Spinoza and Nietzsche. But he thought it was an illusion as well. The first dogma which I came to disbelieve was that of free will. It seemed to me that all motions of matter were determined by the laws of dynamics and could not therefore be influenced by human will, even in the instance of matter forming part of the human body. There are many other philosophers actually who do not believe in free will. Some of them we'll talk about in video 2, but there's a lot we won't have time to talk about at all. So here are a number of philosophers who are free will skeptics. Not all these people were professional philosophers, but they all made philosophical arguments. Okay, another transition. This is Mount Constance in the Olympic Range on Washington State. Now, this was taken from the same spot as those previous photos that I showed, the previous 2 photos I showed, but this is looking west at Mount Constance instead of looking south at the fjord and Mount Rainier. So, the biology of free will. Advances in biology, especially neurobiology, have made it very hard to support the existence of free will in humans. It's getting harder with every year that passes, well, every month that passes maybe. It started early, though. You may recognize this guy. He calls free will a delusion. The general delusion about free will is obvious, says Darwin. Criminals should suffer consequences solely to deter others, and I would add in there to protect society, rather than blaming and punishing. This view should teach one profound humility. One deserves no credit for anything, nor ought one to blame others. This sounds a lot like Nietzsche, but Darwin died just as Nietzsche was starting to write books, so Nietzsche had no influence on Darwin. Many other biologists feel the same. The debate about free will, long the purview of philosophers alone, has been given new life by scientists, especially neuroscientists, studying how the brain works. What they're finding supports the idea that free will is a complete illusion. Jerry Coyne is a professor at the University of Chicago. Here's one of Dr. Sapolsky's colleagues, Professor David Eagleman, and he says in modern science it's difficult to find the gap into which to slip free will, the uncaused causer. There's that again. Because there seems to be no part of the machinery that does not follow a causal relationship with the other parts. And the discoverer of the structure of DNA, along with James Watson and somebody who's frequently forgotten, Rosalind Franklin, who had a lot to do with it, but never got credit, or very much credit. And he said, you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And our old friend, Professor Sapolsky, this is a paraphrase from his book. From spending my decades thinking about behavior and the biological influences on it, I'm convinced by now free will is what we call the biology that hasn't been discovered yet. It's just what we haven't discovered as a cause for our behavior. And this is why the arguments supporting free will are shrinking rapidly as we make advancements. By the way, this argument is similar to the concept of the God of the gaps argument, if you're familiar with that idea. We're not going to discuss that because that's a different topic. But as things are discovered in science, the role of other things tend to shrink. Now, Nietzsche saw this 150 years ago. He said, even if the inherited habit of erroneous esteeming and hating continues to govern us, it will grow weaker under the influence of growing knowledge. Same concept. Now, he meant scientific knowledge, of course. Nietzsche had a habit of being ahead of his time in many different areas. And the neuroscientists have shown that Nietzsche was right in saying this. So, he said, Sapolsky said, we are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that has brought us to any moment. Again, this is the luck thing that I'm so fascinated with. But it'll come up again in video 2. So people think this, you've seen this before, intent to action, that this step represents free will, but we've discussed already, it does not. Once the prefrontal cortex has formed the final intent, this is an automatic process. So we humans only really see what's in the red circle. We don't realize that our intent came from an unbelievably complex set of causes, which you see here. There's a lot more going on than we perceive. I made this figure only to address the factors that can increase negative behavior. So this is just a very selected group of factors that may cause people to have violent or antisocial behaviors. It doesn't include things like the reasons you like chocolate or blue shirts or orderly dishwashers or any of that kind of stuff. And consider that these are only a fraction of the factors that affect human behavior. It's just a very small, even though there's quite a few here. So we can't just focus on the red circle. We have to look at all of this. And of course, our brains are only looking at that last part. So again, the only way to slip free will into the process anywhere is with some sort of magic. Okay, another transition. This is the Big Quilcene River. It was one of our favorite hiking areas on the Olympic Peninsula when we lived there. Okay, now let's turn to the physicist case against free will. And they've basically, to summarize it in a very simplified way, everything that happens has a cause and is subject to immutable physical laws of the universe. So some of the philosophers, by the way, some of the philosophers have made similar statements to this. Okay, so here's Democritus. I mentioned him earlier. He's one of the, he along with Leucippus, one of the early Greek atomists, people that came up with an amazingly accurate, not in the details, but in the general concept of an atomic theory. And they said basically everything in the universe is made up of atoms in the void. There is no free will because everything is subject to deterministic physical laws. Then Epicurus came along, and that made him a little uncomfortable. Epicurus and his Epicureans adopted atomic theory, but they tried to restore free will with a thing called the swerve. And then Lucretius, who was a Roman who died in 55 BCE, described Epicurus's ideas in The Nature of Things. I have a couple of copies. This is the prose version, which I prefer. An amazing book. I put off reading this for decades. I knew about it, but I didn't read it until maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And I'm not sure why I waited, because it is truly an amazing book. They talk about not just atomic theory, but evolutionary theory and sense perception and all sorts of other things that scientists know to be true today. And also the swerve part of it was described by Harvard Shakespeare scholar Stephen Greenblatt. The swerve, how the world became modern. I think that's what it says. Yeah, how the world became modern. Which is also a very interesting book about how they discovered Epicurus after, in the 1400s, after him being missing for a long time. So they made up the swerve out of thin air to salvage the idea of free will. And it reminds me very much of a famous scientific cartoon. This guy has a formula on the blackboard, and then right in the middle he says, then a miracle occurs. And his colleague says, I think you should be a little more specific here in step 2. So that the swerve that the Epicureans came up with was made about as much sense as that. But then not much happened until the Renaissance. And Marquis de Laplace, a French mathematician, argued that a superintelligent, it was called a demon, a superintelligent being who knew all the physical facts about the world at a given moment could apply Newton's laws to predict precisely what would happen in the future. So I think many physicists would agree that the universe is determined, but I don't think they would say it was predictable. That's what Laplace was claiming. Those are different things. They agree that things are determined but not predictable, and there are reasons for that. But either way, it doesn't make any room for free will. So this was called Laplace's demon. But for me, the only thing that's demonic about Laplace were his Laplace transforms, which you see an example of there. Our pharmacokinetics professors at UCSF loved Laplace transforms. We students, on the other hand, didn't love them. We had no idea what they were talking about. But here's a rather well-known physicist who didn't mince words. I do not believe in free will, period. Now, we'll read the whole quote at the end of this video because it is just priceless. But Einstein was very clear that he did not believe in free will. And neither did Stephen Hawking. Though we feel we can choose what we do, our understanding of the molecular basis of biology shows that biological processes are governed by the laws of physics and chemistry, and therefore are as determined as the orbits of the planets. And he also said, it's hard to imagine how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems that we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion. Theoretical physicist Brian Greene is also very much on board. Free will is the sensation of making a choice. The sensation is real, but the choice seems illusory. Laws of physics determine the future. And by the way, we'll talk about in video 2, he lives his life this way. He actually is able to apply the lack of free will to his life, to his benefit. Lawrence Krauss said, everything, a theoretical physicist, everything I know about the world tells me there's no such thing as free will. And Sabina Hassenfelder is pretty adamant about it. And she doesn't mince words either. I think free will is logically incoherent nonsense. Throwing out determinism because you don't like its consequences is really bad science. And she also has a mathematical expression that disproves free will. I will take her word for it. There are many other physicists that I didn't have time to talk about who are free will skeptics. Basically, they're saying your brain and body are made up of particles, and those particles follow universal physical laws. No room for free will without inducing magic. So here's some scientists, and I've lumped biologists and physicists together here, but there are scores of others that have the same viewpoints. So given the lack of any scientific evidence to support free will, I don't think it would be unfair to say the burden of proof has gotten to the point where it's on those who claim that free will exists. As we pointed out earlier, the fact that most people think they have free will is a pretty flaccid argument when you put it up against all of these scientific arguments. Okay, lastly, we'll talk about other people. This is Hurricane Ridge. Ruth and I were on a snowshoeing expedition in the wintertime. It was a beautiful day, looking at Hurricane Ridge, looking across the valley at the Olympic Mountains. So let's look at some miscellaneous thinkers. We're all on the home stretch here: historians, public intellectuals, political theorists, journalists, etc. There's actually a lot more people that are not in those previous categories we talked about who are free will skeptics. Historian Yuval Noah Harari is an Israeli historian, a brilliant guy. His books have sold something like 50 million copies. Sapiens, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, Nexus, which I just recently read. So he said free will was always a myth and not a scientific reality. From a scientific perspective, humans, certainly they have a will, they make decisions, they make choices, but they are not free to choose their will. So this is Schopenhauer's thing again. Their choices are not independent. They depend on a million factors: genetic, hormonal, social, cultural, and so forth, which we don't choose. That's the same thing that La Rochefoucauld said too, back in the 1600s. Here's another brilliant guy, Alexander Herzen, Russian intellectual. And Tolstoy said he'd never met anyone with so rare a combination of scintillating brilliance and depth. And Isaiah Berlin, and he does pronounce it Isaiah, not Isaiah, said Herzen was the forerunner of much 20th century thought, and that his memoir was a literary masterpiece worthy of being placed by the side of novels of Tolstoy, Turgenev, and Dostoevsky. Now, that book that he mentions, which his memoir, is this one, My Past and Thoughts. I'm not finished going through it yet, but it is a remarkable book. And as Isaiah Berlin, who is a pretty remarkable guy himself, called it a literary masterpiece. But there's also a biography, which is this one. This is what got me hooked on Herzen. I have several more of his books back there. This is The Discovery of Chance by Eileen Kelly. I don't know if you can see her name on there. And it's from this book that I got this next quote of Herzen's. Herzen, I guess I should say, which is, and this is just marvelous. I mean, this kind of writing is unbelievable. All the individual side of human life is buried in a dark labyrinth of contingencies, intersecting and interweaving with each other. Primitive physical forces, dark urges, chance encounters, each have their place. They can form a harmonious choir, but equally can result in dissonances that can tear the soul apart. Into this dark forge of the fates, light never penetrates. The blind workmen beat their hammers aimlessly, not answering for the results. So, All this is precisely what neuroscientists like Sapolsky are telling us. And this is why Tolstoy said that Herzen awaits his readers in the future. He said, quote, Herzen, quote, awaits his readers in the future. Far above the heads of the present crowd, he transmits his thoughts to those who will be able to comprehend them. Well, I think we're ready now to comprehend him. Arthur Koestler, another gifted thinker. And the fact that it's another guy and not a woman shows that very few women were given the opportunity. There are plenty of just as many brilliant women as brilliant men in these days, but the opportunity to participate in philosophy or science, no matter how brilliant they were, just wasn't there. Still true in many areas. But back to Koestler. He was a public intellectual with a deep knowledge of both science and philosophy. And he's a wonderful writer. He's one of the best writers I've ever seen. And after reading the book you see at the bottom there, Reflections on Hanging, for my death penalty work, I read another half dozen of his books, as well as his biography by Michael Scammell, Koestler was an amazing character. He escaped death narrowly several times. But he said, from the scientific point of view, man's actions appear indeed as strictly determined by the genes which transmit his heredity, by the functions of his glands and liver, by his upbringing and past experiences which mold his habits and thoughts, his convictions and philosophy, as the functioning of a watch is determined by its springs, wheels, and bearings. Now, okay, most watches today don't have wheels and bearings, but you get the point. So Koestler does not see an opening for free will either. And the last person I want to talk about is comedian Jon Stewart, who was another brilliant person. It's obvious. You just have to listen to him one time and you know he's brilliant. Jon Stewart was interviewing Carlin and asked him what the secret to his comedic longevity was. He just kept going and going. And Carlin responded, the luck stroke. Got to have luck in this world. Part of it, if it's your genetic makeup, that's luck. And what you do with it is also partly genetic, because hard work is genetic, the desire to do hard work. Oops, sorry. Now, he knew it was also partly his upbringing and his environment. He knew that clearly. And he had no control over that either. But it's so refreshing to have someone who's so successful recognize the role that luck played in his success. And Einstein would have agreed with that as well. And we're going to end with Einstein and his marvelous statement on free will. I do not believe in free will. That's the part I showed you already. Schopenhauer's words, man can do what he wants, but he cannot will what he wills, accompany me in all situations throughout my life and reconcile me with the actions of others, even if they are rather painful to me. This awareness of the lack of free will keeps me from taking myself and my fellow men too seriously as acting and deciding individuals and from losing my temper. And another quote that we'll show you in video 2, he also talks about that it promotes a sense of humor. I'm not sure how that happens, but in any case, Einstein obviously believed that his lack of belief in free will was an important feature of his worldview and contributed to his peace of mind. So I consider this maybe the best statement ever made on free will. It came from a genius in physics. So that concludes part 1, why we have no free will, where we presented the main arguments against free will from philosophers, biologists, physicists, and various other people. Many other people have weighed on against free will, but it would have taken a 3-hour video to go through them all. So in part 2, we get to the good stuff, because in part 2, we talk about why the lack of free will is such great news. We will debunk the false fears, such as that everyone will run amok and we'll have murderers running on the streets and we have to give up morality and we have to give up right and wrong and we won't be able to hold people responsible and people can't change and that life will lose meaning and we'll have to eliminate Nobel Prizes and Oscars, et cetera, et cetera. None of that is going to happen. All of these things that people worry about are not going to happen. In fact, many of those things will actually get better. So We'll also talk about then benefits to the individuals that I can attest to personally, and that a lot of people who are free will skeptics have noted in their own lives. And then finally, we'll talk about benefits to society, which may be even greater than the benefits to the individual. So I hope you watch it. Thank you very much.